Good. Okay. So 2 weeks ago, before the Jesus film, we ended up talking about how the Old Testament points to the Gospels. And in fact, if we did not have the Gospels, the Old Testament would feel incomplete. And now we're going to turn to the New Testament. The material from Acts to Revelation, would it make any sense if we did not have the Gospel accounts? If we only had Acts through Revelation, what difference would that make? I'm not asking whether the epistles quote the Gospels, because most of the epistles were written before the Gospels really were being spread around very much, if at all. So we're not looking for the epistles to quote the Gospels. We're looking for confirmation. We're looking for evidence that the written record of the Gospels validates the claims of Acts through Revelation. So what evidence do we find? The website blueletterbible.com lists 300 New Testament references and quotes from the Old Testament. It is possible that not all of these link to the story of Jesus, but this website lists at least 52 references to the Old Testament, quotes or references. So that's talking about tying together the old and the new. One of the great examples that is not immediately obvious is the message of the martyr Stephen in Acts chapter 7. When the first 10 times you read it, you just go, good grief, all this history. But what it's doing is it's showing the connection between the history of Israel and the message and experience and what happened in the life of Jesus. Without the record of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, Stephen's testimony would be meaningless. It may have happened. He may have actually witnessed the resurrection, but it would have little impact beyond the immediate group unless somebody had written down the record of Jesus' life. Then there's simply the title Christ. The title Christ took on a special meaning after the life of Jesus. It was before that, it was a title that could be applied to anyone who had been anointed by God for his service. But after the resurrection, in the New Testament at least, it became almost another name for the humble carpenter preacher from Nazareth. So I did a quick web search for the use of the title Christ from the book of Acts through Revelation, and blueletterbible.com that I mentioned before lists 389 usages of the title Christ. Now that many references becomes meaningless unless Jesus lived, died, and was raised from the dead. And unless we have a record of it, then we have no proof of the significance. So we're talking about the interweaving between the Old Testament, the New Testament post-Gospels, and the Gospels themselves. There's one more little instance that's of personal interest to me. When I studied at Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri, USA, I wrote a research paper comparing the Epistle of James to the Sermon on the Mount. In that paper, I documented 10 instances in which the author of James taught a morality unusually similar to what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. There are actually more than 10 instances, commonalities, but I investigated 10 specific ones. And clearly, James did not borrow from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount because it had not been passed around yet. The point when I wrote that paper, my original purpose was to show that the author of the Epistle of James grew up in the same home as Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, they were half brothers. But my point here in mentioning it today is that James's lessons are nothing more than moralizing unless we have the message of Jesus, the life and message of Jesus. It's just another man giving his opinion, a wise man, but still just his opinion. It lacks support until we see that he was teaching almost the same moral code that Jesus taught. Then we have strong support for James's message. Okay, that's just a brief glimpse at New Testament, the New Testament post-Gospels connection to the Gospels, and the interweaving of the Old Testament, the post-Gospel New Testament, and the Gospels themselves. They all tie together. You have already studied this in previous classes. We're reinforcing it here, and I am going to go to a little video, not there, but here.
You've probably heard of the idea of having If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much, and that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning. Hey, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We think one of the best ways to understand the Bible is to take its core theme.
Okay. So that is, am I still on screen? Okay, good. That is the covenants that helps us visually see how all the different parts come together in the covenant, and finally, ultimately, in the covenant with Jesus, the new covenant. So we started out asking, why study the Gospels? And the subtopic there was kind of a dumb question, but now we're going to why 4 Gospels, and that is not so dumb of a question. Why not just one account? Why 4? I want to hear from you. What are your opinions of why we need 4 rather than just one written account? No ideas?
Pastor.
Yes. I'm listening. Michael, were you saying something? Because I can't hear anything more. Okay, let's move on and look at these. Do you know who this couple is? Anybody recognize these people? Is anybody there?
Yes, Pastor.
Okay. Do you recognize this couple?
No, Pastor.
Ooh, okay. Well, I would not have either, but I'm a foreigner. This is Manuel Quezon and his wife, Aurora. We have a province named for him and another province named for her. In a moment, I'll show you another picture of them, but I want feedback here from you. What does this picture tell you about former President Manuel Quezon? What does it tell you about his wife, Aurora? Obviously, this is a posed photo. They did not just happen to be casually sitting there on the patio and somebody just accidentally happened to take a snapshot. This is posed. This is telling us a message about them. So what is the first thing you see? What's the first thing that this message tells you, this photo tells you about President Quezon?
He's reading a book, Pastor.
Right, he's reading, and what does that tell you about his interest in life? That's good. What does it tell you about him?
That he's a reader.
He's a reader. Good. Thank you, Kevin. Somebody else. If he is a reader, what does it mean about his character? It means that he's intellectual, he's academic, he's interested in always, I mean, this is not when he's a young man, this is in his mature years. So he's always interested in growing, in improving, in becoming a better person. All of that is wrapped up in the fact that he's sitting here reading a book, not a comic book, not a, what's that other word I just heard yesterday? Anyway, this is a serious, heavy book. Now, behind him, at his shoulder is his wife, Aurora. What does her posture, her position, her presence in that picture, what does it tell you about her? What kind of woman she was?
She's supportive.
A supportive wife.
Good. Who spoke first there, young lady? Somebody? Sinota.
Janine.
Janine, thank you. Sorry, because I don't have any of the pictures up. Okay, so she's supportive. Anything else that this shows you about her? Now let's go to the next picture. What does this picture tell you about them as a couple and individually?
It shows that they really love each other.
Good. They're devoted to each other. Very good. What else? Okay, where are they located compared to the first picture? They're outdoors, right? They're either on the dock overlooking the ocean, or they're on a ship out on the ocean, right? So they're enjoying nature, okay? So two different pictures that show different aspects of who they are and their relationship to each other. Let's switch to the other side of the world, actually a contemporary of President Quezon. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt standing at some kind of a gate there with his wife behind him. I think she's holding her hat on her head, and he's standing there. What does that picture tell you about President Roosevelt?
Greatness, doctor.
Greatness. Okay, greatness. Good. What else?
Happiness.
Happiness. Good. Good. And it tells you that he's healthy and strong, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's another picture of him. Very rare to see him like this. This is the real image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He actually had polio as a young man and spent most of his political career in a wheelchair. If you put those two pictures side by side, you would wonder if it's the same man. But they're two pictures of the same person showing different different details about him. The public in America almost never saw him either standing or in a wheelchair. Almost always was sitting in a chair to hide the fact that he had polio and could not stand for very long, could not stand without help. So two different pictures showing different aspects. One more. If this was the only picture you ever saw of President Trump, you would think he was always angry, always mad, always yelling. But if this is the only picture you ever saw of President Trump, you'd think he was the nicest person in the world. Two different pictures of the same person. So why 4 Gospels? Well, if you only had Mark, you would be, as you'll see when we get into the individual Gospels, if we only had the Gospel of Mark, you'd be left with a mystery of who this man was, who Jesus was. If we only had Matthew's version, we might think that Jesus was only for the rich and only for the Jews. If we only had Luke's version, we might think he was only for the poor and the outcast. And if we only had John's account, we would know he's from heaven, but we wouldn't sense any earthly connection with us. So that's why we have 4 Gospels. To give us a fuller picture of who Jesus was and what he was like. So I'm trying to find my place in my lecture notes here. When we take all 4 together, we are able to look at Jesus from multiple angles. That is important. We're able to see Jesus from multiple angles. We get a more complete picture of where he came from, why he came, and what he wants to do in us personally, and what he wants to do in our world as a whole. So it's not such a dumb question after all, is it? As we go into this further, we need to have the assumption that God did inspire 4 records, not 1, but 4. If and since God inspired 4, then he had a reason. And at least part of that reason was because each of the writers had his own special burden, his own concern. Each of them faced his own situation in his own local congregation, and in part, his narrative of the gospel story was written to address these local challenges. Given that each gospel was written for its own perspective, it makes sense then when we preach from one or teach from one of these narratives, our sermon or lesson should take into account the special emphasis and the burden of each author. To preach from Mark's account of the feeding of the 5,000 should sound different from preaching from John's version. Why? Because each of them had his own way of blending that event into his overall narrative. In the 2nd century, the late 100s, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, France, compared the 4 Gospels to 4 regions of the earth. He felt that each evangelist presented the message for his theological position. John wrote the divine word of God, Luke about Jesus, this is a quote, Luke about Jesus' priestly role, Matthew of his humanity, and Mark of Christ as prophet. We might have a different spin on it, but that that's a good distinction. Hopefully, as the course progresses, we will see that each evangelist does indeed present Jesus from a different angle with a different emphasis. So, why four Gospels? It's not such a dumb question. The more angles mean a more complete view. Thoughts, reaction. Okay. Come on down, people. Find a chair and join the group. Right? Come on in. I thought I put you in here once already. You keep going out. I know I brought you into the room. Okay. There. What are your thoughts about this first presentation today?
Pastor,
Yes.
it's Michael. One thing I can reflect on our lesson and presentation just now, Pastor, is that we know that we are acquainted, or we know that there are the three first books, or we considered as the Synoptic Gospel and then the Book of John. So though in this four gospel we can see the parallel passages talking about Jesus, but the way we interpret it, as you said a while ago, it's important to really consider the burden and the context, or the audience of every author, that how they presented Jesus in their own writings, or in their account.
Mhm.
So that's the thing, Pastor, that um, we really have to understand that it would be incomplete if we cannot see Jesus, or present Jesus in a multiple view.
Good. Good. Thank you.
Pastor.
Thank you. Good. Any other thoughts? You've jumped ahead of me a little bit, and that's good because we all know about the Synoptic Gospels and their interrelatedness. And a little later in the semester, we'll talk about them more completely. But that is a good thing to keep in mind. Okay. Any other feedback on why we've got four and not just one? Even of the synoptics, Michael just made a distinction between the three synoptics and the Gospel of John, and they are different. But even among the three synoptics, as he suggested, they each have their own angle, their own perspective, and their own burden, and their own message that God has inspired them to share. Okay, we are going to go to the next topic. And this will sound a little bit redundant, but it is not. This sets the stage for how we're going to study the individual Gospels And so this becomes very important stuff. Well, I think what we already did is pretty important also. Okay, let's go here. Yes, somebody start. Yes,
Pastor,
yes,
can I ask a question, Pastor?
of course.
Oh, I don't know if anyone from the class have the same question, but I just think of it right now, Pastor. The reason behind, or I know if you have anything and you can respond. Why is it that among the 12 disciples, why is it Mark, Luke, and John? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, what's with them, Pastor, that um they were the one who was considered as the four gospel who really I
So
know yes, Pastor.
why were those accepted into the canon and others were not? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, Pastor, among the 12 disciples that were with Jesus,
Hmm.
why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Or I mean, only the three synoptic gospels
Hmm.
who told the account of Jesus, knowing that they were eyewitnesses. But I think some of the disciples as well are eyewitnesses. But
Right,
considering the fact that the three or the four were able to conduct a careful study or
right,
investigation about the life of Jesus Christ.
right.
But why the four of them or the three of them, Pastor?
Well, okay, let's do a brief, a very minor adjustment. Luke was not an eyewitness. Luke was a close associate of Paul,
Yes, Pastor.
who spent time,
A doc-
and Luke and Paul himself was not, as far as we know, was not an eyewitness to any of it, but had spent time in the desert with him. But why these four and why not a bunch of others? Um, We'll probably get into that a little bit more when we get into the discussion of the synoptic problem. There were other writings being circulated. Um, I presume that when you did your New Testament survey that they talked about the process of being accepted into the canon, which does not really answer your question. Was that Michael asking that, or who was asking that? Who asked that question just now?
I'm the one, Pastor Michael.
You, Michael. Okay, I thought it was the same voice, but I wasn't sure. Um, okay, when you had your New Testament survey class, I'm sure you talked about the process of canon, of being accepted into the canon, the accepted inspired scripture that we know of as the Old Testament, New Testament. For the New Testament, the requirements were either written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle. The exception being the letters of Jude and James that were written by, we believe, the half-brother of Jesus, half-brothers, plural, of Jesus. So these are people who had close personal contact, first generation followers of Jesus. So that's why there are not others, but it does not answer Michael's question. There were other accounts going around, most of it oral. And why these four sources became transferred from the oral tradition into the written tradition, I don't know. You know, in my opinion, Thomas, he was busy going east into India and getting martyred there. Others were going in other directions. There's a tradition that I'm sorry, I just caught myself almost saying a historical falsity. But the other apostles went in all different directions. So maybe they wrote something, maybe they didn't, but it was not generally circulated among the Mediterranean church. And it was the Mediterranean church that largely decided which accounts would be accepted. Then there were second generations and third generation gospels that were written that frankly did not qualify because they were not first generation, and did not qualify because they started teaching things that really were nonsense, such as, and I don't have the name of it, but one or two of them talk about Jesus as a child taking some mud and fashioning it into the form of a dove, and the dove taking life. Those kinds of fantasy stories just would disqualify. We want believable miracles, which sounds contradictory, but we want something that's verifiable. Beyond that, maybe you need to go on for your master's degree at Asia Pacific Nazarene Theological Seminary and ask one of the professors there. Being a little bit facetious, but really that's how much answer I can give to it. And hopefully when we get to later in the semester, get to the actual topic of the Synoptic Gospels, maybe we can dig into it a little bit more. Is that satisfied for now, Michael?
Yes, thank you, Pastor.
Okay, yeah. And you began that by saying maybe nobody else has this question, but all questions are good because it's almost certain that other people are asking similar questions. Okay, now I will go into the next topic for today, which is titled Overview of the Gospels, and it really deals with a number of different points. So we're going to start with asking students to read some verses, okay? So let's see how this works. These are the verses, and I want you to choose. And if you were not here the first week or two, when you step forward to read a scripture, I much prefer that you read it in your home language. I think one of the students said that they don't have a Warai translation, but choose something, because I know what it says in English. So the first one that I want us to read from is Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 4, 5, 6, and then jump down to verse 10. So somebody find that in your language and read for us, please. Don't make us wait a long time. We've got a lot of material to cover here.
Angie Pastor.
Okay.
Cebuano version. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 4, 6 and 10. Nakita ko ang usa ka unos gikan sa amihanan, ug gikan sa bagang pangano pangilab ang kilat ug migsanag ang langit. Diya sa langit nga nagpagngilap ang kilat, nakita ko ang adlaw nagilak-gilak nga bungsi. Apan ang matag usa kanila. Upat ka naong ug upat ka pako. 10. May upat ka nagkalain-laing naong ang matag binuhat sa atubangan, naong sa tao, sa tuo, naong sa leyon, o sa wala, naong sa turong baka, o sa luyo, naong sa agila.
Good, thank you. So somebody else get ready to read Ezekiel 10 to 14, and while you're finding that, you can look at this close-up of the image. You can see the man's face, the bull's face to his left, our right, the lion's face to his right, our left, And then behind, presumably, is the face of the eagle. So somebody read in your language Ezekiel 10, verse 14.
Ako, Pastor.
Mhm.
Ezekiel 10:14. May upat ka nawong ang matag binuhat. Ang una nawong sa turong baka, ang ikaduha nawong sa tawo, ang ikatulo nawong sa leon, ang ikaupat nawong sa agila.
Good. Aguila. That's a word from Spanish. Okay, good. And now from the book of Revelation. I don't know that I ever saw this before until fairly recently. Somebody read from Revelation chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, please.
Ako pa. Dito.
Go ahead, Juna.
Ginpadayag, chapter 4, verse 67. Sa atubangan liwat ang trono may aga sugad ng dagat nga salamin, nga malinaw nga matinaw sugad ng kristal. Palibot ang trono nga kada ligid dito, may ada upat nga buhi nga mga binuhat nga lukop ng mga mata atubangan hanhat talikuran. Ansyahan sugad ng leon in panagway, ani kaduwa sugad ng todo nga baka. Ani katulo may ada na nga sugad ng kanang tawo, nga ni kaupat sugad ng nalupad nga agila.
Good, good. Why am I showing these pictures? What does this have to do with the four Gospels? Any guesses? I'll save your trouble. Over the centuries, those four creatures, those four faces, those four beings, whatever you want to say of it, over the centuries, those four identities have come to be associated with the four Gospels. Since the very earliest times of the Christian movement, these four creatures, these four beings, have been associated, and it's not saying we have not. The Christian tradition has not been saying that Ezekiel or John had the four Gospels in mind when they saw these visions, but they saw the visions, and then the followers of Christ have come to associate these images, these creatures with these four Gospels. Very consistently, the Gospel according to Matthew has been pictured as the heavenly creature who looks like a man. Just as consistently, the Gospel according to John has been pictured as the eagle. There has been a little going back and forth on the other two, but eventually it has pretty much been settled. The Gospel according to Mark would be pictured as the lion, and the Gospel according to Luke would be the ox, the baka. But keep in mind, there is nothing sacred about these connections. They are pictures that help us see some of the themes of each of the gospel accounts. And I have found the association to be very helpful. And I hope they will help you remember which of the gospels has which emphasis. So there you can see the pictures a little bit more closely. The upper left would be homo, that's ang tao, a man. Upper right, Leo the lion. Lower left, ang baka, the ox, the bull. And then lower right, ang aguilar, the eagle. So they came to be associated with each of these. Okay, so we will come back to those images as the semester goes along, especially after the prelim exam next week. The following week, we'll be into Mark. We'll talk about how his gospel, how the lion helps us remember aspects about Mark's gospel, and we'll move on from there. But I wanted to introduce it now so that as you're reading and preparing, you have this in mind. Okay, so what kind of genre are we reading? Are we studying? You've had in your hermeneutics class, you talked about genre and how that influences our understanding and our interpretation of a passage. And really, anytime we're reading anything or listening to music or watching a television program or a movie, it's important for us to understand what genre we're watching or reading or listening to, because the genre tells us how to interpret it. Yeah, okay, I'm tempted to talk about some examples. I will a little bit. My wife, Nancy, loves sci-fi. I put up with it because I love her. It's not my style, but I enjoy fantasy. And so with her, I have watched Lord of the Rings 3 or 4 times, the entire 9+ hours of the trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. Different genre. Both of them are imaginary, but it's a different genre with different rules. So when we come to the 4 Gospels, what is the genre that we're studying? For much of the history of the Christian movement, people have assumed that the Gospels were simply biographies. Never mind that the chronology did not line up with each other. They were assumed to be simple biographies. And so various people, as recently as the 1800s and even into the 1900s, various people have tried to create what we call a harmony of the Gospels. And you can find them fairly recent efforts at that. They've tried to fit the narratives together to make a sequence of events to show the biography of Jesus, but they always ended up with some pieces that just did not fit. For example, John has Jesus clearing the temple at the beginning of his narrative. The other 3 Gospels, the synoptics, have him clearing the temple during Holy Week at the end of his ministry. Some people say he did it twice. Others insist it was just one, and then they have to argue over at the beginning or at the end. There is a disagreement over which day of the week Jesus celebrated the Last Supper. Was it Thursday night leading into Passover, or was it Passover day itself? You cannot solve that problem, either of those, by simply reading the text as it is. Did Jesus, the healing of the blind man at Jericho, did he heal one blind man, or were there 2 there? Was it out? They were outside of Jericho, but was it while Jesus was going into the city or coming out of the city? And you see, if you're just trying to harmonize the Gospels, you've got these problems that just will not fit. And I could name a few more. So what I'm saying is that try as we might, a true biography did not seem to describe the Gospels. And so what do we have? We have what is called ancient biography, and it is a different genre. When we look at biography in modern literature, modern biography wants to know 2 things: a clear sequence of events from birth to crisis to death. And they want to see character development. Literature critics want to see a well-rounded person. If all they see are actions, then they consider that person flat, no personality. So modern writers find ways to illustrate what kind of person the main character was. But when we read the Gospels, we're not reading modern biographies. We're reading what is called ancient biography. And one of the differences is that ancient biographies were more interested in moral character than in personality. They were more interested in the type or example more than in the rounded individual. And in the Gospels, the character of Jesus is depicted not by direct analysis, but by the narration of his great deeds and words, his miracles and teaching. Perhaps another way of looking at this is this: we will not learn if Jesus was right-handed or left-handed. We will not learn if he was an early riser or a late night person. We know that sometimes he left the group early in the morning to go out to pray, but other times he was out in prayer and meditation all night long. We know we will not learn if he was an extrovert or an introvert, but we know that he attended social dinners and parties, but introverts do that also. So we don't know those psychological details because the gospel writers were not concerned with that. In ancient biography, that was not important. What we will see in the gospels is his character, and the character will come through his actions and his teachings. As a result, we need to remember something very important. The writers were not always concerned to tell the events in the order that they happened. So in Mark, we have a series of events. Jesus crosses the lake, he does something amazing. Then he immediately crosses the lake again and does something amazing on the other side. And then he immediately crosses the lake again and does something else amazing. That probably is not how it actually happened. But Mark is trying to demonstrate something that has to do with the message that Mark has. Mark was concerned to tell us what kind of person Jesus was. And these amazing things he did reveal something about Jesus' character. And more to this concept than what I've said here. But it's important that we realize the events did really happen. They may or may not have happened in the order that the evangelists told them. As we study them, study what the sequence tells us about Jesus and what the sequence tells us about the author's message is what it tells us about the author's audience and about his message about Jesus. Questions, comments? Is this all new information or old that you've already heard a dozen times?
So is it to say, Pastor, that we are studying or the four gospel is in ancient biography genre?
Yes, yes.
So, Pastor, how about a narrative, Pastor? Um, is it a part of a genre of the gospel being a narrative?
Okay, let me see if I understand the question. You're asking if narrative is a style, is a form of ancient biography. Is that what you're saying?
The four gospel itself, Pastor.
Right. They are written as narrative, but
But the genre.
within the umbrella category, narrative would be a broad category of genre. And within that broad category, you've got different genre. You've got sci-fi as narrative, fantasy as narrative, modern biography as narrative, ancient biography as narrative. So all of those are genres within the umbrella of narrative. Did that speak to your question?
Yes, Pastor. Thank you.
Okay. So as you're studying this with if you've done any study of inductive Bible study, then you would study this in terms of a narrative passages, yes. But then with the idea that, for example, when we get to the point of comparing this synoptic gospel with that synoptic gospel, don't bother yourself with which sequence of events is correct, because the writers themselves were not so concerned with that. Now, in my opinion, Luke was concerned with that. In my opinion, Luke's account is the most historically accurate in terms of sequence. Others would say Mark. I say it's Luke, but that even then, that is secondary. What's really important is, as Luke tells his narrative, as Mark tells his narrative, and the others also, what are they saying about Jesus? What does Jesus say about himself? What does the way they put the pieces together, what does it say about the author and about their audience and about the message that the Holy Spirit is saying through them to us today? Let me go down here, because this is kind of the triangle of our interpretation. The triangle, if you hear people talk about it, it's talking about these three points at the outer angle, and people who talk about it just kind of assume that the Holy Spirit is involved. So I have inserted Holy Spirit in the middle there, who inspired the author, inspired the text, and inspires the reader then and the readers now in understanding. So this is kind of the different parts of creating the four Gospels that we will be studying. Okay, so with that said, yeah, let me go back to that for just a moment. Okay. For example, when we start in the book of Mark, there's no place in there that says, this is Mark writing to you. This is Mark writing to the church in Rome. Nowhere does it say that. All we have is at the very start of the Gospel of Mark, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I am sending my messenger before you who will prepare your way, the voice of one calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. That's verses 1 to 3. We do not know the author. Tradition tells us one thing. Recent research suggests maybe something else. We can assume a little bit about the original listeners because of the time period. We assume they lived somewhere in the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, probably the 1st century following Christ's crucifixion. With some research, we can come to understand some of the factors about their lifestyle and how that might interact and influence what the author wrote. So we need to know as much as we can about these other details in order to accurately understand and interpret the passage. Only then can we fulfill our calling. Somebody read for me 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. I'm waiting. 2 Timothy 2:15.
Second Timoteo chapter 2 verse 15. Apan naluwas siya pinaagi sa iyang pagpanganak kung magpadayon sila sa pagtuo sa gugma ug sa pagkabalaan nga may kabuutan.
Good. Thank you. Approved to God as a worker who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. We cannot accurately handle the word of truth unless and until we have done all we can to connect author to text to readers and back to author. And that, mga kapatid, that is what this course is about. Learning how to learn what these 4 world-shaking pamphlets meant in their day and what they mean today. It is our goal, my goal, not to give you information, but to make, it is not my goal to fill you with information. It is my goal to help you find some of the information, but my real goal is that you find some information, that as you find some information, you will learn how to keep finding more information, and then you will be motivated to lead others in the exciting process of discovering who Jesus was and is, and leading them to becoming disciples along with you. Questions? I'm going to getting ready to shift out of this to another subtopic here. The questions about this. No questions? Everything, as we say, clear as mud?
So far, Pastor.
So far, okay? Okay. Now, have you studied the intertestamental period, what happened between the Old Testament and the New? Has that been part of your course study to date? Okay, whether it has or not, we will do a little review here. I love how this guy handles it, but as he talks about it. So we're trying to get into the attitude and the perspective of the people in Jesus' day. And to do that, we need to handle some of the history. Have you ever wondered what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Join the club. Many of us just go happily from Malachi to Matthew and never think anything about the jump. But others of us end up confused. So let me see if I can put this in Filipino terms. Actually, this video I'm getting ready to share is this video I'm getting ready to share. He uses an example from the US, and it's just not good. So let me see if I can put it in Filipino terms. Imagine that you were living on Mactan Island. You were one of the loyal supporters of Lapu-Lapu in 1521. So 600 years ago, right? 500 years ago. You watched the hero of the Visayas with his warriors defeat the foreigners. Then suddenly you get transported through time to 1921, just 100 years ago. But now it is 400 years after Lapu-Lapu's victory. How would you ever explain what had happened to Mactan Island, to the changes that had come to the Visayas and the rest of the Philippines in those 400 years? How would you understand that? How would you understand that Mactan was now part of a larger nation? And how would you grasp all the other changes that had happened between when you left Mactan in 1521 and when you came back in 1921? It is kind of like that when we jump from the end of the Old Testament into the beginning of the New Testament. So with that in mind, let's watch this video that fills in some of the empty spaces.
Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. The last historical pieces that we have in the Old Testament involve the Persian Empire. And you'll remember Cyrus the Great defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great, by the way, he named himself that, the Great, then sent the Israelite captives back home, the captives back to Judah, to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, and specifically to rebuild the temple, because he believed that the reason the Babylonian Empire fell was because they didn't take care of these temples of all these gods of these nations they conquered. So he sent the Judahites back home to rebuild that temple. They rebuilt the wall, rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. That's about the last that we have. But other things happen. The Persian Empire goes on for a while, but about 333, thereabouts, a man comes on the scene whose name you know, Alexander, also named himself the Great. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, by the time he was 33 years old, had conquered the world. This whole area, stretching from Greece up here, all the way down, all the way across, even beyond this map, all the way in India, that area was area that Alexander the Great had conquered by the time he was 33 years old. Quite an accomplishment for a young man. He then died of a social disease he contracted while he was traveling. Alexander, knowing his death was coming, reasoned, I cannot allow anyone, nobody is great enough to rule the empire that I ruled. So he decided to divide his empire among his 4 generals. Now 2 of them, Ptolemies and Seleucus. The Ptolemaic Empire is this green section down here, and the Seleucid Empire, the red section up here. That was ruled for several hundred years, a couple hundred years, by descendants of those generals. You'll notice that Jerusalem, sitting right down here, is on the cusp between the 2 empires. And so Jerusalem was kind of back and forth during that time period. There comes a time under the Seleucids when a man by the name of Antiochus, and he has a number after his name, Antiochus IV, begins to reign. Antiochus IV names himself, and he names himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest. The people renamed him. They called him Epimanes, which means crazy fool. So he had 2 names, the one he preferred and the one that nobody called him to his face. When Alexander had conquered the world, one of the things he tried to do was leave behind Greek culture all over the world. He was a devotee of Greek culture, including architecture, dress, language, all kinds of aspects, religion, all kinds of aspects of Greek culture. Well, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, decided that he wanted to Hellenize, and that's the word we use for establishing Greek culture. He wanted to Hellenize or establish Greek culture in Jerusalem. Now this was going to go over like a screen door in a submarine. It did not go over well. One of the things he did was he outlawed all circumcisions. Nobody could be circumcised. Some of the men, the Jewish men, because they would compete in the sporting events, and in competing they would compete naked, surgically reversed their circumcision. I'm not going to go into how you do that on stuff they didn't teach me in Sunday school, but they did it. That was an abomination to the devout Jews. Antiochus even went further. He decided that this Jerusalem temple was a real problem, so he intentionally desecrated it. He went into the temple, he went into the holy place, and on the altar, he burned a pig. Now, if you know anything about Jews, you know burning a pig on the altar in the Jerusalem temple is going to be sort of the ultimate abomination. He wasn't through. He took the juice from that pig and he sprinkled it on the walls of the temple, intentionally irritating, intentionally infuriating the Jewish leadership. There was a clash. Out of this clash arose a family called the Maccabees. That was their nickname, means the hammer. And Judas Maccabeus was the sort of leader of this group of rebels who were going to oust Antiochus Epiphanes, oust the Greek rule from Jerusalem, and restore the temple. He does that. He gets the job done. The Feast of Hanukkah grows out of that incident when they're locked in the temple for 8 days and the oil doesn't run out, and the oil for the candles keeps burning. And so there are 8 days of Hanukkah. And the temple is restored, and the religion of Israel is restored. Things kind of go along smoothly. Well, they're not terribly smoothly, but for our purposes, we won't go into all the details, until a guy by the name of Pompey decides to conquer the world. Pompey is a Roman general, and in 63 BC, he comes into Jerusalem with his armies, and now Israel, or Judah, moves from Greek rule to Roman rule. Rome sets up a series of governors in Israel, or in Judah, and you know a couple of them. You know Herod the Great. He's a governor, even though he calls himself King of the Jews. And you know Pontius Pilate. It's into this world that Jesus comes. It's into this world that the New Testament takes place. But if you don't know that 400 years history in between, some of what happens in that New Testament is not going to make a lot of sense to you. And what's going to happen in that New Testament, you know it and I know it. God is going to send his son, Jesus Christ, to redeem the world. We'll look forward to moving in that direction in next lessons.
So you have the intertestamental period. This is the period we talk about between the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi, who prophesied in about 420 BC. Between him and when Immerser John comes on the scene, about approximately 30 AD 30. So we call it 400 years of silence, but if we're going to be technical, it's 450 years. Let's review these main events that happened during this intertestamental period. So you've got Persia. This is the country where the Jews, the Israelites, had been exiled following the capture by Babylon. They had been in exile there until Cyrus the Great sent them back with specific instructions to rebuild the temple. Ezra, Nehemiah, Malachi were all part of that rebuilding season. And then what was the year that he told us the year for Alexander the Great? The year was 333 BC, 333 BC. And by the time Alexander was 33 years old, he had conquered what they considered as the known world. Logically, that doesn't make sense because you get to the boundary of that and you know that there's more land over there that you haven't conquered yet. But for our purposes, he had conquered the known world. He was getting ready to die. What was the cause of his death?
Social disease.
A social disease, yes. STDs.
I remember, Pastor.
Go ahead.
What kind of disease, or I mean, was it mentioned specifically? What kind
The-
of social disease?
No, this video did not say specifically what it was. Simply, he called it simply a social disease. But we know that Alexander was a very immoral man, and so we can connect the pieces there of what he's talking about, right? So as death is approaching for him, he divides his kingdom into how many parts? 4 parts, right? And the 2 main parts that have to do with the culture and history of Jerusalem and Judea. And those 2 parts are ruled by 2 generals. What were the names of the generals? I can't remember the name. Okay, the one in Egypt was Ptolemy, P-T-O. The P, I guess, is silent, Ptolemy. And the one in modern day Turkey was Seleucid. And then, and what was, somebody tell me, what did that have to do with Jerusalem? That you had Ptolemy to the south and the Seleucids to the north. What did that have to do with Jerusalem? What was the effect? Hello? What was the effect? You don't remember? Okay. The southern portion of the empire, the Ptolemaic portion in Egypt, controlled Jerusalem at first. And so they would have influenced Egyptian culture, a combination of Egyptian Greek culture. And then the northern kingdom, Seleucids, when they took over Jerusalem and Judea, they would have imposed more,
Rome.
even more of the Greek culture. So you have, and then Antiochus the fourth. What did he call himself?
God manifest.
God manifest. And there's a Greek word there that you will hear when you read, you will see that Greek word connected with him. They'll say Antiochus Epiphanes.
Epiphanes.
Epiphanes. Everybody say it. Antiochus Epiphanes.
Antiochus Epiphanes.
I heard one voice. Good. Okay. And what did he do in Jerusalem?
Desecrate or
Desecrate. Okay. I need somebody else to jump in here in addition to Michael. He's being very interactive and getting points all over the place. I need some other people to participate so that you get points for having participated today. Anybody else remember specifically what was the desecration that he did?
Burned a pig past in their temple or the Jerusalem temple.
Okay, who's that speaking?
Kevin.
Kevin. Okay, thank you, Kevin. He burned a pig. Okay, and what did he do then after burning the pig? Somebody else jump in.
Sprinkle the blood, Pastor, on the wall.
Sprinkled the blood. Who's Sinota?
Jonah, Pastor.
Juna. Okay, thank you, Juna. Yes, sprinkled the blood around the temple. What was the reaction then of the Jews when that happened? Okay, let me rephrase the question. Did they just say, well, okay, another day, we'll just go on? Okay, they got pretty mad, and that brought on a family by the name of Maccabeus, or the Maccabees, and they led a revolt, and eventually that led to a siege of the temple when the loyalists were trapped inside, and the miracle of oil being provided for the lampstand continued to burn for 8 days without being refilled by any human means. What was the holiday? What is the holiday that is celebrated even these years, even this coming December? It will be celebrated by the Jews, that arises from that miracle.
Feast of Hanukkah, Pastor.
Feast of Hanukkah. Thank you, Jenna. Yes, the Feast of Hanukkah celebrates that miracle. But then who stepped in 63 BC? Who invaded and conquered Jerusalem? Do you remember the general's name? Very famous man, important man in history. General Pompey came in and conquered Jerusalem and established Roman rule there. That's important for us because that means that's why the Romans were ruling Jerusalem when Jesus was born. That's why Caesar Augustus could send out the decree demanding a census to be counted, as Luke records for us in chapter 2. That's why Herod could have authority. That's why Pontius Pilate was there, all because in 63 BC, General Pompey came, conquered the city, and made it part of the Roman Empire. Now, all of that has to do with creating the political social atmosphere for the time when Jesus was on earth, and the time that the gospel writers were writing their account. Let's see if what this does. Is that going to go automatic? No. Yes, it is. So there are these political, social conditions that were prominent during the time that really made it very beneficial, very helpful for the establishment of the Christian movement. Now, I gave you a little peek there. I want to see how many of those 7 political, social conditions you can remember and say back to me now.
Greek language.
Greek language. Who was that? I need you. I'm sorry, I need names.
Rose and Pastor.
Roseanne, okay. Greek language was prominent. Another one.
Roman peace or Pax Romana.
Pax Romana. Thank you, Gia. Do you go by G?
Travel.
Ease of travel. Thank you, Eli. Okay, what else? We got the first 3 out of the 4 ready, listed.
Old tradition changing.
Good, thank you, Renalyn. Yes. Next, what's number 5? Okay. 3 more to go. Okay. You did very well. You got 4 out of the 7. So that's about a C plus grade, right? It's a little more than half. Okay. So the Greek was the language used throughout the empire. It was what we call the lingua franca, the language used in business or commercial activities. Can we compare that to Tagalog in Philippines? That each different region has their own local language, but Tagalog is the Tagalog is the language that covers the nation. Nancy insists on calling it Filipino. I always call it Tagalog, but anyway. So it acts as the lingua franca. As a result, in Jesus' time, anywhere that a witness of Jesus went, she found people who could understand their testimony. The Pax Romana, in the heart of the empire, society enjoyed what historians call Pax Romana, the Roman peace. On the edges, there was still conflict, but in the Mediterranean Sea in that area, basically you could move around without significant threat. And number 3 is connected with the others. Travel was very advanced. Mail traveled swiftly. Other purposes of travel were also easy. It would take another 1,000 years before transportation caught up with the ease of travel during this particular century. Old traditions were changing, breaking down. Blomberg, your text, calls this, quote, a cosmopolitan spirit. It describes an attitude of openness to other viewpoints and other traditions, interaction between different people groups. Number 5, related to number 4, was barriers between ethnic groups were breaking down. Number 6, Christianity seemed like just a variation, another version of the Jewish religion. And so it enjoyed the same special treatment that Judaism had at first. They were a legitimate religion and allowed to operate by their own traditions. And up until that time, this was the fairest court system yet, especially for Roman citizens, as we see in the life of Paul, but really even for others, there was a degree of fairness. And so we have this verse in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, where Paul talks about the fullness of time. In the fullness of time. And we use that in a theological sense, in a biblical interpretation sense, but also in a social-political sense, that all of these factors came together. Even the practice of crucifixion came together at that time. And I heard one preacher, he's a well-researched preacher, so I take him at his word, but he said that it was a 1-year period of time when the Jews were not allowed to execute without Roman authority. And it was during that time that Jesus was condemned to death, and that's why they had to take him to the Romans to be crucified. So all of this, Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his son. So we've been talking about the intertestamental period, but we need to talk about also an overlapping term for an overlapping period of time. This is the Second Temple period. So you need to keep these two distinct, and I'll give you a graph, a table in just a little while that distinguishes them. The Second Temple period started approximately 516 years before the Christian era, when Cyrus the Great sent the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. It was during the Second Temple period that you had the rise of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and other groups that we'll talk about either today or at the beginning of next week. And then the Second Temple period ended with the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Jewish temple, and the forced expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem, and that was in AD 70. And so you have here a table comparing the two, and I encourage you to get these two time periods clear in your mind, because in your reading, in your studying, for one thing, they both influence what's going on during the life of Jesus and as the Gospels are being written. By the same token, they overlap, but the one extends beyond. So they're not the same. The Second Temple period, the intertestamental period. Okay, how do I do this? I'm going to go beyond to the next one so that we can review this. I'll come back to this slide in just a moment, but tell me again, somebody, when did the Second Temple period start?
(516 BC).
And what was the event that happened then?
Rebuilding the temple.
Rebuilding the temple. Thank you, Kevin. And when did the Second Temple period end?
70 AD.
70 AD. Thank you, Angie. And what was the event that happened at that time?
Destruction of Jerusalem.
Destruction of Jerusalem, of the temple specifically. So, okay, we call it 500, 600 years. By that mathematics, it's actually 586 years. But okay, so we've got those dates. Now, somebody who has not spoken up, it's to your advantage, to your benefit, to jump in and tell us here now. The intertestamental period, when do we date that as beginning?
420 BC, Pastor.
420 BC. And I was going to ask you this a while ago, Gia, do you go by the full name Gia Marie, or just Gia, or how do I call it?
Gia Marie.
The whole name. Okay. Thank you, Gia Marie. So it began 420 BC. What was the event there that we marked connected with that date?
Malachi, the last prophet.
Okay. Thank you, Gia Marie. Again, I need somebody to step in who has not spoken yet, who has not contributed. I don't need it, but it's to your benefit, okay? When did the intertestamental period end?
450 years.
Okay, that's the amount of time. Thank you, Aldrin. Yes, that's the amount of time, about 450 years. We usually, in common speech, you'll hear it referred to as 400 years of silence, but you're right, it's about 450 years. And so what was the date that I gave you? Okay, if it began 420 BC, what year would be 450 years later? Okay, anybody, even if you've spoken up before, what's the year that that began, that ended? AD 30. Thank you, Rovelyn. Good. And what was the event that we mark at that time?
Mercer's John Ministry Pastor.
John, thank you, Angie. Yes, Immerser John begins his prophetic ministry. And so when we talk about the intertestamental period, we're talking about approximately 400 years of silence. And what we mean by that is there was no prophetic voice from God. The Old Testament prophet Malachi ended his prophecy. We had no more prophetic word, no more prophets were calling the Jews, the Israelites, the people of God to faithfulness until Immerser John came on the scene approximately AD 30. Okay, I think I'm going to end this at this point and come out of the screen share so that we can answer whatever questions there might be, and then we will, for our breakout group time, you probably want to review today's material and the material we've had in the previous weeks to prepare for the preliminary exam next week. Last time, the previous 2 weeks, I've let you go and do it on your own. This time I encourage you to stay in your group, study together as a breakout group, and prepare for the quiz, the exam next week. I will be here. If you have questions, you can message me. I'll come into your group, into your breakout group, and answer the questions as I can there, okay? You will be in the same breakout group for the rest of the semester. So whatever group you were in 2 weeks ago, that's your group now. Those of you who were not with us 2 weeks ago, I have communicated with you separately. You are in room 4. And so we've got 4 rooms. And I'm putting this so that you choose your own group, but choose them according to the group that you were in already. Is that clear enough?
Yes, Pastor.
Always makes me nervous when the same person tells me that they understand, and I appreciate it. I really do appreciate it. But here's what happened when I asked about the Jesus film. I asked you, have you seen it before? And everybody was silent. And one person said, no, Pastor. And everybody else was silent. And then when I got your reaction papers, I saw that almost all of you had already seen it a few times. So are my instructions regarding the breakout rooms, is that clear? Okay, I'm opening the rooms now. I encourage you to spend the next hour in the breakout rooms preparing for the exam next week. And again, like I said, I will be here to come into your room and answer questions as you raise them. Okay? Go.
Pastor Glenn,
Yes.
I just want to ask if is there a possible way for us to access the recorded discussion?
That we've had so far?
Yes,
Yes.
Pastor.
Yes. In fact, thank you for reminding me. I need to go over here and stop the recording. Okay. Stop